There we go.
Okay, excellent. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Boglarka Eliz Varga, and I graduated MA Printmaking from Camberwell, UAL. And I initiated this event because throughout the 2 years, we were encouraged to make these connections between research, artwork, subjects, the medium we worked in, and I came through Silje. So Silje she graduated MA Book Arts, and Nicole, she graduated also printmaking. So I worked alongside Silje in the at some point, and then I looked more what she's working, and she worked her subject was similar to mine. It's about childhood and memory, and I also saw Nicole's work, which was she was also again working with archive and memory and photographs. So I thought, well, this is a very good opportunity to talk about our work. And Odette England work was crucial in my research. Her work is a little bit about memory and photograph and the idea of how photographs and photography is a material in her practice. So we are going to start to show you a video what Odette recorded. She unfortunately cannot be with us because she's in America and it's different time, but she kindly accepted this invitation and created this video for us. And after the talk, after her artist talk, the three of us are going to share with you our practice and these links. So I hope you will enjoy. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Odette England. I'm an artist and writer based in Providence, Rhode Island and in New York. I'll be speaking today about my creative practice at the kind invitation of the University of the Arts London. I've divided my talk into 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to give some brief background to my interests and my preoccupations as an artist. In the second part, I'll talk about 3 past projects that focus on autobiography, home, performance, the archive, ritual, and vernacular photography. And then lastly, I'll speak about some recent and upcoming book projects. So to start, I'm always doing things to images like this one. This is a photograph I made on film, printed onto French newsprint, and then rubbed with ash that I collected from the devastating wildfires in Australia earlier this year. For me, a photograph is always a starting point, not the end result. It's a material. I treat it like I would wood or rope or clay or steel. Photographs to me are very special. They're part object, part window to another world, part lie, part extrapolation. They're records of a reality at a point in time. The camera processes the information, but then I elaborate on that. So mine is very much a process of elaboration through performance. And as an artist, I'm resolutely anti-passivist. My hand needs to be visible in my work. My work focuses on home and autobiography, as I mentioned, and the nuances between how memory grows weaker and more abstract over time. And so many of the things I make incorporate a sense of weakness. I like to write or rewrite my own stories over the top of what the camera records. And I use the camera to have a conversation between the present I and the past me. It's like a need I have to scratch my name into a tree and say, I am here, I am visible. The second note to make about my practice is that at its heart is labour. I've always been a doer-maker, and that doing often involves performing with my body, my hands, my mind, the objects that I'm laying my hands to. The act of looking at something or looking at someone is itself a kind of performance, but looking at a photograph looking at it really carefully doesn't mean we see it, and I mean really see it. And I think that's because we all wear the distorting glasses of our personality and our biases. We all have biases as makers and thinkers and producers of meaning, but so does what we choose to work with and what chooses us. I'm mindful that when I look through the viewfinder of my camera, I change the way that I observe things. I change the things that I observe. But that exercise in observation doesn't stop with that look. It doesn't stop with the press of a shutter. And this image on screen is a good example of that. This is from a negative that I buried in 2018 in the soil of my childhood home. And then I dug up and printed from it this year in 2020. It's also a good example of my work being a form of therapeutic theatre in a way. I revisit home, what home means. I do that with my mother and my daughter. Mum and I share stories and memories from our past tied to the land, and our narratives start to intertwine with fiction. And then my daughter hears these oral histories and she on-shares them. So there are always layers of identity, memory, authenticity, self-reflection, self-indulgence, self-representation overlapping in my practice. The third note about my practice is that for me, work makes work. And by that I mean I make work through the process of working. My work doesn't come into being until I'm playing with it or shuffling it or taping it or putting pins in it. I feel I have to be physical with it, as with this print that I dug up after several years underground, and then I tried to scrub it clean. So the tactility of getting to know my material is critical, and there's always a balance between process and product. So now I'm going to focus on 3 past projects. These are all types of intimate, personal performances. I read a lot about performance, everything from the book An Actor Prepares to the more recent book, The Self in Performance. So much of these projects in particular pertain to sight, context, psychology, and the aesthetics of photographs as objects. So this first project we're going to look at is Photos of Me Without Me, which I made in 2011. Family snapshots are objects that I use often, whether I'm using them in work or using them as inspiration for work. For this project, I stole snapshots of myself from my mum's photo albums, and then I deliberately, very carefully scissored myself from them and then realigned the hand-cut splinters. I was very interested in what happens when we challenge our likeness and how we're represented in an image object, and especially what happens when we question the status of an original. So these gestures were unrepeatable. There's a sense of violence. They're permanent. I can't return them to their original form. But they weren't made from a place of upset or revenge or sadness. They were made from a place of curiosity. These snapshots all hail from between 1975 and 1984. They were mostly taken with my mum's Kodak Instamatic, and then there's a few taken with my dad's Polaroid camera. I like this work because I came from a painting background. So at that time, there was never any pressure for me to make photographs. As the artist Jan Groover said, who also came from a painting background, there was no pressure to make good photographs, not great photographs. For me, I could just use photographs as a material. I could also use myself as raw material. I could mine my past in a liberating way. And I didn't have to use the camera just to witness and record things. All of these works are titled Without Me. This is Without Me number 7. And in some of them, you'll see there's a little evidence of a person or a happening. So in this one, for example, there's a shadow on the pavement near the bottom of the image. Or like in this one with the child's bike. This is Without Me number 9. Someone described this work to me as pushing old images into the future, which I like. And I think for me, it's also extracting the flatness of identity from one mode of viewing to another. And each time I revisit this work and the older that I become, the more I question my behaviour here. Should I have done this? Should I have asked permission? Would I have gotten that permission? What would have become of these snapshots otherwise? So these images will always illustrate the complexity of the landscape of selfhood. The second body of work I'm going to show is called Punched from 2018. So this is skipping ahead 7 years. A lot of my work reflects a literal assault to a photographic object, and specifically its surface, like these snapshots, which I hole punched and then layered one on top of another. I enjoy the transgression of destroying snapshots as a type of object that we often laden or burden with feeling. And when I intervene, and I do see it as an intervention, I'm re-choreographing stories. I'm revising the conditions for viewing. I'm changing the manner in which these objects behave, the manner in which they live, the way in which they will be read and understood. To make these works, I relied very much on a combination of trial and error and intuition. And as I was making them, I became especially captivated by the photograph's edges, how they felt, how they bent, how they responded to pressure, how I could move and manipulate them, and that in moving and manipulating the object, I was also doing that to myself and my past. The author Lyle Rexer once wrote that photographs are mute and vulnerable to all sorts of compromised interpretations. And I like thinking about that vulnerability and slipperiness in context of this work. There's a selection of these, including this one, currently on show in New York City at the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts. And here you can see my glass urn that contains all of the punched little pieces that came out of those snapshots. So this is another example of material that I have stored away to keep for another project, perhaps one day. The third project I'm going to talk about is called Thrice Upon a Time. This was made in 2012, so it sits between Punched and photos of me without me. This was a performative homecoming in collaboration with my parents. Under my direction, my parents revisited the 200-acre dairy farm that they lost to near bankruptcy back in 1989. And they made these visits in 2012 every month for the entire year. And during these visits, they wore on the soles of their shoes colour film negatives that I had shot at the farm 5 years prior. So I tasked them to wear these negatives, 3 or 5 or so on each shoe, while trying to find locations where my mother had made snapshots of my brother and I as children. As my mum and dad walked their former lands, the negatives became damaged and abraded through this act. And then my mother would send me the shredded negatives so that I could print from them. And along with the negatives, she would include handwritten letters and short films of her and Dad's walking adventures. So you can see here my mother's shoes are on the left and my father's shoes are on the right. My mum took these photographs. So this is before they began walking on one of their monthly visits. Here's my dad at the farm. It's winter. You can see, I can tell that from the green grass, which was only present during winter. This image was taken with by my mum with her Kodak Instamatic, and it's the same camera that she used to make snapshots of me as a child. This was after one of their walking adventures. So after an hour or so, this is how their shoes looked. And then this image is after my mum has painstakingly removed each negative from each shoe and then put them into individual envelopes. This is one of those many envelopes that my mum sent to me with negatives in it. So she started separating them into individual mum and dad piles, and she would number each envelope. And so those words and her writing became the titles for the work. And I just love that she had written here, "Dad trod on a snail" on one negative. So this is an example of the large-scale resulting pigment prints that I made from these damaged negatives. This work was exhibited shortly after 2012 at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. It was also shown at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago and at the New Mexico Museum of Art. Most fortuitously, the project received the Center $5,000 Project Launch Award, which was juried that year by Virginia Heckett, who's the curator and head of the Department of Photographs at the Getty Museum. And it was shortlisted in 2015 for the Australian Photo Book of the Year Award. This image is called Dad Number 3 Right Foot. I like this one because the image in the background shows what was my dad's bullpen, and that little silhouette there looks like a bull looking up to the heavens. This one is called Mum Number 14 Right Foot. Mum has a smaller size shoe and a lighter tread, and so her negatives were far less damaged than my father's. This is Dad Number 4 Left Foot, and you can see very clearly his tread in those grainy red and yellow halos at the top and bottom of the frame. That's his dairy in the background and his shed. And you can see off to the right-hand side, there's a very thin line of trees way off in the distance. That's where the Murray River is. The Murray River is Australia's largest river, and it provides fresh water to all of these small farming communities where I grew up. Now, uncannily, that break across the centre of the negative looks a great deal like an aerial view of the Murray River where our community is. Someone pointed out to me not long after I made this work that what I was really doing with it was forcing the hand of memory, and that in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, when my parents are asked about the farm, they're going to recall this process of revisitation and treading negatives rather than the original memories from when we lived there as a family. I like to think about how my parents reactivated this space, how they reacquainted themselves with it, the stories that they would have shared while they were doing it. It was the first time that they'd been back to the farm in almost just over 20 years. And I think what these images really depict in that sense is that their place, or what they regarded as their place and their home, as they remember it, has gone. You can see here an example of what one of the damaged negatives actually looks like. This is a picture of one of the properties on our farm, and it's almost been circled and positioned just right. And here's what the print looks like. The negative in the centre there bent as I was scanning it, and so it created this darker half moon shape. The French psychologist Pierre Janet once wrote that memory is an action, and essentially the action of telling a story. And I very much enjoy putting that description in conversation with this work, that memory is an action, the action of telling a story, the action of telling a story through tread, through wear, through revisitation, through pain, through loss, through experience. And this is how the work looked installed at the New Mexico Museum of Art in 2012. To finish, I'm going to talk about some recent and upcoming book projects that I have. And given that my practice is so deeply rooted in memory and forgetting and objecthood, it's not surprising that my first book would be an edited volume of photographs that reimagines, reflects on, pays homage to Roland Barthes' Winter Garden photograph. The Winter Garden photograph is an image that Roland Barthes describes in his book Camera Lucida, which was published 40 years ago in 1980. Roland Barthes was a French literary theorist and writer, and he goes to great lengths to describe this photograph in his book, but he doesn't reveal it. It's never published, not in the book nor elsewhere. It's an image of his mother, Henriette, when she was 5 years old, and she's standing in a winter garden. Now, Barthes never married. He lived with his mother his entire life. So she was, in a sense, the love of his life. And when she passed away, Barthes was understandably traumatized, and he put much of that trauma and sorrow and pain into writing Camera Lucida. After her death, Barthes went searching for a snapshot that he thought best showed his mother's essence and as he thought she really was. And he finds this image and calls it the Winter Garden photograph. So I created a project, and that involved inviting just over 200 photocentric artists, writers, curators, historians from around the world to submit a winter garden photograph of their own, which I then published into this book called Keeper of the Hearth. It was published in the winter of this year by Schilt Publishing. And Keeper of the Hearth is what Henriette's name means. My next book project is also a collaborative and performative one. In 2018, with my peer and friend Jennifer Garza-Cuen, we participated in the Robert Rauschenberg Artist Residency in Captiva in Florida. And while we were there, we used Rauschenberg's darkroom and expired vintage photo paper that we found in it to make almost 200 unique photograms. We took this found paper and we floated it in Rauschenberg's pool at different times of the day and night and for different lengths of time. And so we let the performance of nature and the performance of the environment embed itself into the paper. So every photogram has its own unique photographic DNA. So the light, the duration, the water, all of these elements made these images what they are. So for us, it was a letting go of control and allowing the place and the materials to dictate the visual response. In a recent presentation, David Campany said that when you collaborate, you produce a third thing if there are two people, and that third thing can be very special. And that's what Jennifer and I found working together. We liked the alchemy of what we got together that we wouldn't have been able to achieve alone. So our book is called Past Paper, Present Marks, and it will be published by Radius Books in the spring of 2021. And it will include essays by the curator and writer, David Campany, along with Susan Bright and Nicholas Muellner. This work also debuts in an exhibition at the Penumbra Foundation in New York City later this month. What knits these and all of my other projects together is this obsession I have with reperforming the past and reperforming parts of history. I do that through the photographs I make, through the family snapshots that I have stolen or inherited, and through various photographic objects that I've collected over time. I also do it through a constant process of agitating what's inside of me and what sits outside of me. I'm going to use a quote from the Swedish poet Thomas Tranströmer, who, this is from his work Preludes. He writes, "Two truths approach each other. One comes from inside, the other from outside. And where they meet, we have a chance to catch sight of ourselves." I've been thinking about that quote a lot in context of the third book that I'm working on right now. This will come out in the fall of 2021. It's a book that's going to look more critically at autobiographical memory, but through the lens of place and gender specifically. And you can see on screen a draft layout from that book. I love how photographs undercut memory. They're very good at that. And I think memory is a very fickle mistress. I read somewhere recently that memory makes images out of what it values, but that value is always changing. In his book, The Subversion of Images by Paul Nouget, he talks about how objects always seem to have the last word. And I agree with that, especially if I'm thinking about photographic objects. He goes on to say that even while remaining familiar, the object can isolate itself and suddenly acquire, by emphasising or juxtaposing this or that characteristic, an authentic power to provoke. And my hope is that my work can achieve that in some small way, because I never want my history to let go of me. Thank you for watching and for listening, and I hope you will be in touch if you have comments or questions.
Okay, it was great to watch Odette's talk again. Hope everyone enjoyed it. I think now we'll talk to you guys a bit about our work, just to give you a sense of what we do. I think starting by Silje.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Silje, and I graduated from MA Visual Art Book Arts this summer. So I'm a visual poet, artist, and the founder of Melon Press. And Melon Press is a poetry press devoted to visual poetry that works across languages. So in my work as well, I explore memory and space through photography, language and layering, and often in the context of nature. So let's see. So yeah, this is my kind of final work of my MA alongside Melon Press, and it's called My Friend the Girl from the Circus. It was an open call. I was invited to join a visual poetry exhibition in the beginning of this year, and it was called Temporary Spaces. So I thought about a temporary space, and outside my parents' house there is this large football pitch, and often throughout the years there would be like a circus visiting this space. So I went back home and I photographed this space and walked around it. And then I took the photographs inside and I started writing on top of them. And initially it was just photos or like visual poetry for this exhibition. And then I started reworking it and reworking it and reworking it, and it turned into several pieces. So we have this one here is a digital print risograph and copying and letterpress. It's like multiple processes. And then this one is just digitally printed and Photoshop. So over lockdown, I displayed my work in my own bookshelf, and then I posted this on Instagram. And I also do like altering and changing the work. So I made a performative video of me altering one of the copies I have. So.
Yeah, so yeah, Silje said, I graduated from May Fine Art Printmaking, but do work with photography quite a lot. So I make a lot of 2D collages using photos found in different types of archives, as well as 3D collages and more photographic installations, or 3D collages as I call them. So in this work, for example, there's a photo found in the National Archives from my hometown, Nicosia, in Cyprus. And on top, there's photos from my phone. So in this case, I'm combining historic archives with personal archives. So you could go to the next slide, maybe, Silje. Yeah, so for this work, this is where I'm actually taking printed photographs or digital prints and layering them and taking a photograph of them. So I guess it's photographing in these two senses. But I also really like to explore situating photographs in a space and how like photography plays with our sense of place and identity as well. And the next one. Yeah, so this photograph as well has combines photos from like the National Archives and my phone archives. And also I'm quite interested at the photographic backdrop as just as a form and visually, but also as context and how context can affect the narrative, I suppose. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Eliz, yes, you can get on.
Hi. So I graduated also printmaking from Camberwell. My work, I take photographs as well as I collect photographs, and these photographs mostly capture my family life. Is not just families, it's more a domestic, it's the domestic place, what is captured through my images. And in my final work, I wanted to do something. Obviously, due lockdown, I couldn't do it, and something came back to me, which is very interesting. When I started my MA, one of my friends, she suggested, oh, well, maybe if your subject is motherhood and the family and your relationship with your daughter, when you will graduate, you should do your final show in your house. And in the beginning, it was a joke. I took it as a joke, like, you know, how people would be able to come to my house because London is so big. And due lockdown, actually, this is what happened. So I created this installation called Video Installation in Domestic Space 1. which is an accumulation of a projection, which called this carousel. You are going to see, I'm going to talk about more carousel in the next image. And there, I also work with my family archive. So you can see a small other projection with my parents that is a colored slide from their wedding. Under the chair, there is another slide which I brought back from home, and on this image is not quite visible, but I also brought back to me to London a small projector which is a Romanian. I'm from Romania, and this been made in Romania, and it's very old. It's like almost 40 years old, and then I played around and how this work was born, that, you know, in the end of the day, after homeschooling and a busy day in the house, I was just too tired to pack away basically my daughter's toys. So I just started to project just around the house. I just left everything. And then I realized that actually this is quite interesting, like how these objects are sort of playing around with the projection, and how it can also stop as enhance this installation. So then the next day, so I played around this idea, and then the next day I would ask my daughter, oh, why don't you play in the corner of the room? And then I left everything as she, you know, set up in her little game during the day, and then in the evening I would project and I would play with the projections. So this is how this video installation was born. Can I have the next image, please? So I usually take photographs on digital, like on my iPhone, or I'm using certified film, an analog camera. And these are images taken, you know, while we were out with my daughter and with my husband, and it's called carousel because these images are supposed to be projected in a wheel. They are going round and round. It's sort of having this idea of this never-ending photo carousel, and these images are digital. So these are digital collages, and it plays around the idea of identity, motherhood, as well as privacy. So what I've done, basically, I used images only where my daughter is out of focus, or I cut out her from many images. Can I have the next one, please? I'm interested in how photographs are actually objects, how we can alter, how we can cut physically, but also how sometimes out of our hands these images change. So this image is so I played around with a few images from Carousel and another a series of my images, and the Photoshop glitched these images, so I wanted to save them, and when I tried to save, this is what happened. And now I started to think about photographs as digital files, and what's happening with these digital files, how these memories are changed, not just through process, but not just through a physical process, but through a digital process, which is I'm not having control over it. So yes, thank you for listening. These are our words.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any questions or wants to join our conversation, we'd love you to turn on your mic or type in the chat if you want to. But while you do that, yeah, I guess we could talk a bit about the links between our works and Odette as well. But what I liked about what she was talking about, I think she mentioned at some point, the photographs are parts lie. So I was interested to hear about you guys, because I guess, Eliz, your work is more documentary. And Silje, your work shows us, I would say, something more like a representation of a moment. So I was wondering if you feel like it's more, if you can see this tension of the real and the representation of something in your work, or how do you feel about the duality in your work?
So for me, actually, from this particular project, my friend, the girl from the circus, I've actually combined memories, and I feel, coming from a creative writing background, I'm used to finding inspiration from my own experience, my own memories, but then also kind of changing it and having that artistic freedom to write or make whatever I want. And I definitely do that in my art practice as well. So by joining some of the truth, and then so I guess I haven't thought about it in the same sense as I feel like Odette did, but I definitely do the same thing in my work. What about you, Eliz?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I believe that even though my images are more documentary, or is like a recording of my family life, but through their sense of snapshots or vernacular photographs, I don't plan these photographs. I'm just taking these photographs, and many times I realize that these might show something totally different from what actually it happened, or how things are happening in a family life. So taking out this, why I started to be more sort of cautious with my own work, and this is how Caruso was born. That the images I've taken, it was truth for me, but for someone else it showed a completely different thing. It wasn't a lie but it's the duality of the image, which it's not exactly a lie, but obviously it was totally different, which I think it was very interesting. So yeah, I think the idea of lie is also how we see it. She said, or that at some point, that even the act of seeing is a performance, and obviously we all have our own personal memories which we sometimes project on these images, and those might be lie for the original image. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you said it's not exactly a lie, but it can be entirely truthful, since it's a selection of something. But yeah, I feel like the performative elements, I feel like there is a performative element in all photographs, in that they're not entirely truthful. But yeah, I guess in Odette's work, it's interesting because it's more like an added layer of the performance, because we can see the action on the surface of the photograph.
I was wondering, when it comes to like performance for you guys, do you feel like, because the process of making and working, you kind of talk about it as performative, so that would be like more of a personal performance rather than like an performance for an audience. And how do you feel about that kind of relationship? Is it entirely a performance for yourself, or is it a performance that could be taken into and shown off for other people?
I think the fact that, for me, the use of personal photographs are brought into this public space is in itself, like a performative act, I suppose. But yeah, also for me, because I make my images like a theater set, so it's almost like these silhouettes and layers are like puppets. So it's almost like they're doing their own thing. Does that make sense? I don't know about you, Eliz.
I see the element of the performative element in my work. I like to capture also movements, and actually carousel. There is images of a performance I attended last year, and also this idea of sort of like cutting out someone and then pasting and being present but not being present, and then the idea of these images are changing on the carousel is that all the time these images are not still, they are still images, but they are still going around, and this is where I see the element and of the performative element, or also in the installation, how I imagine that installation that the viewer can become part of it as the viewer walks around. So it's sort of an invitation to the viewer to participate, to perform, to also through looking to perform or to look around or have make these connections. So
yeah, so actually, Eliz, you said about the cutting out of the person, and David says, several of you and Odette England make significant use of negative space, erasure, obscuring, or otherwise removing elements of the image. Can you talk a bit more about that, and how, as part of your process and practice, you shape those gaps? So I suppose maybe, yeah, you can tell us more about the gap and the removing, I guess, that we all have in our work.
yes.
Should I start? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess for me, the removing and all that kind of started with like the enjoyment of exploring the material and working with the material and seeing what, like Odette kind of mentioned, like I think I really identify with what she says, the process of trial and error, where you kind of just like, you have this kind of piece and you just try and you see what kind of happens with it. And I was wondering if I can just ask you, Nicole, do you, when you cut out things, is that the original or is it a copy?
It's a copy, actually, because often it's either a photograph from the actual archive that I don't have the right to actually take the photo. So it's a photograph of the photograph, or a copy. So I usually print multiple copies. So I'm not too precious about cutting up photographs.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I don't know how I would feel about actually, or in a sense, the kind of last image I showed, that was because I made a very limited edition of that book, and because it uses risograph and all that, I'm probably not going to make any more of those. So in a sense, I did break one of those, but that was actually one that I printed on a different type of paper, and it didn't really work out. So I was kind of okay with exploring that material further by altering it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually in your work, Silje, I feel like the space and the writing over it sometimes reminds me of like the presence of someone. So it gives me that sense of the erasure, I suppose, of a person. But yeah, for me, removing the person but leaving the silhouettes still gives the impression of someone having been there. So maybe it's connected to like the history of what we leave behind. I suppose that's maybe what it symbolizes for me. I don't know for you, Eliz, if you can talk about that.
Yes. So I when I cut out some of my other images, which are not in this PDF, I played around like different type of cutting every time. So what I've done, I usually scan the negatives. I wasn't sort of brave enough to to alter these negatives yet, but I was thinking if I scan them, then I would just have those images scanned, which is interesting to have sort of like a little safe alley, or just, you know, saving a digital file of these otherwise physical images. And then what I sometimes I would print out the images, just like photograph on photo paper, and then I would cut out with the scissors, or sometimes I punch them out. I also draw on them. I am still in the process, and I would say is a process lad. I usually push through my images in different processes, printmaking, or with my hand. I would cut or draw on them, and then I would, because I'm very curious what's happening with the image, what the process does to an image. In a way, I'm letting the process lead. I'm letting the control from my hands, because once I already had a control over these images when I took these images, and then I see how the images are creating their own memory. The object, an image becomes an object, and how this object then creates its own memory. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So we have another comment. Liliana says about the personal family archive. She says, I believe the artist has a deep personal connection with the imagery. What do you think is the role of the viewer, and how does the viewer recontextualize the image? So yeah, I think that's a good question. I guess you guys have used personal photographs. For me, I guess maybe if I didn't mention where I'm from, or where these landscapes are, I guess they could be not anywhere, but I guess everyone has their own associations with particular landscapes, or the silhouettes of a couple, for example. So I feel like, yes, they're personal, but also people could see their families in it, potentially. I don't know. What do you guys think? And also in terms of your work.
So in my work, I guess I use text, which then kind of hopefully gets the reader thinking with, like, so it's like I wanted to, there's one line in the book saying when I was young I wanted to be a part of the circus, and I just hope that when people kind of see that they might think back on what they wanted, and are they doing what they wanted when they were like a child, or has that totally changed? So I think I do it through text, and then kind of hope that starts a memory process, whilst you, Nicole, you remove people, and then suddenly you can just fill it in with your own people, in a sense. I think that's quite nice.
That actually is a very interesting question, and I started to think about my images and my collection of as an alternative family album, and I've done I read about it quite a lot, and then I was doing a research into what family album actually means, and what is the role, its role in the visual arts, and interestingly, what the theory says about the family album, and also like the family archive, that, you know, people would not really save those snapshots, or which are not perfect, which are not depicting like a success, or an important memory, like, you know, wedding or birthdays or first day of school. So in a way, my images are part of this alternative family album, and I believe that those little moments are happening in everyday's life, everyone's life, and there is never like a sort of feeling that you have to compare yourself. Oh, did I have like a nice wedding as that person, or like clothes, or so in a way I let the viewer to be part of it, to recall their own memory from like a little toy, or places, or different events, but these are very everyday, which is surrounding us. So yeah,
great. Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone has any other questions or comments that they'd like to make. Another thing that I was thinking about everyone's work, like something that I've seen in common, is the display of the work and the importance of that. For example, Silje, you obviously working with books and printing, so I don't know, I thought of the connection between photography and the tradition of making photo books and having the tactile photo printed. And at least your work is more with the projection, the particular piece of the projection. Again, the display becomes really important, I think. So I was wondering, I don't know, Elise, because you've looked a lot into Odette's work, if you are aware of the way that she displays her work, or
do you mean Odette? Yeah, I did look. She mostly prints out, and I even looked like how she would frame, and she would frame the works. Most of the works, it would be on the walls, because I was thinking like, how could I make tactile? So I have I actually printed out the carousel, and I created an artist book, because I was interested in the tactility of the artworks of these photographs. So would you blow them up, or would you just keep them small? Odette, apart from her work, which are the physical cuts of the photographs, those are very small, obviously. Some of her images are much bigger, but she would all the time frame these images, which I thought is interesting, because you are not able to touch them, but they are so visually vivid, and you can see the traces and marks on it, that I think it is interesting how it's framed, and is like, it becomes this very personal object, becomes an artwork. And this is where I sometimes I got stuck with my own work, when a personal object, a personal artwork, which is really close to me, to the artist, becomes an object which then going to be exhibited in a gallery. So I think that is very interesting, and it's something which I think a lot about. And yeah, I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, actually, I was gonna say the fact that you said about Odette, how the images are kind of destroyed, or purposefully destroyed, and then framed and put, in on the wall. I think for me is really interesting, because normally you wouldn't display a destroyed or broken photograph. But yeah, I don't know, Silje, how do you feel about that aspect of it?
Yeah, I definitely feel like with seeing Odette's work, I feel kind of inspired to experiment more with that in my own work. So I thought it was very nice to be invited by you, Elise, to join this talk. And I think that is actually all we managed to talk about today, but it has been a very nice talk. So thank you, Nicole and Elise, for joining me, and thanks for Odette for making the presentation and sending it to us. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here. And thank you for all of you who took your time out of the day to join us this Saturday. And if you can think about a question later on, feel free to message us on Instagram or Twitter. So let's see, I have these details here. And yeah, thank you again, Eliz, for inviting Odette and Nicole and I. And I hope everyone has a lovely Saturday and enjoy the Uriel exhibition. So all the details are on the page here now.
I would have just a little message from Odette for all those who are graduating in these very uncertain times. And she says, thank you so much for inviting me. I have enormous respect for every student right now, especially those about to graduate into a fragile world, but one that still holds potential for your new ways of thinking and doing and creating meaning. Your commitment, tenacity, and courage are welcome and needed more than ever. So this is how I would like to say goodbye and to thank you, all of you who were listening to us. And thank you so much, Silje and Nicole, that you said yes for my invitation. And hopefully this project is going to become a physical show at some point.
Yeah.
Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.